Although the time he spent as a full-time wrestler in Georgia was relatively short, the legend of Mr. Wrestling, Tim Woods, his greatest successes and most famous matches and feuds were in that state. It was one of those booking ideas that worked to perfection. Leo Garibaldi was the booker in Georgia in 1967 and wanted to build the territory around the gimmick of Mr. Wrestling, who had achieved some notoriety when he turned into a drawing card for promoter Joe Dusek's Nebraska promotion. Dusek came up with the concept of Mr. Wrestling in 1965, with the white trunks, white boots and all-white mask, as the technical wrestling marvel. Dusek a few years earlier had huge success with another former college wrestler, Big Bill Miller, putting him under the mask as the black-clad Dr. X in 1959 and making him his local world champion. It led to the most successful long-term business period in the history of the city, as the top stars from around the country were brought in to try to both beat and end the winning streak, as well as reveal the identity of the monster heel. Masked heels were nothing new, but this Dr. X became the biggest masked box office success ever, up to that point in time. With Mr. Wrestling, Dusek tried the opposite. That was revolutionary, as there had been few masked babyfaces outside of Mexico that had become major stars. The gimmick was a success as Mr. Wrestling became Dusek's biggest star, regularly drawing crowds of more than 4,000 fans per week at the Omaha City Auditorium. After going to a 60-0 draw with American Wrestling Alliance champion Mad Dog Vachon, who himself was an accomplished amateur wrestler, having represented Canada in the 1948 Olympics, it was announced that in the rematch, with no time limit, that Mr. Wrestling would unmask before the match. Dusek even released that the Mystery Man had twice won the AAU and Big Ten championships. On January 7, 1966, he unmasked, announcing his name as Tim Woods, and won the best-of-3 fall match in 33:57 to become the American Wrestling Alliance World Heavyweight Champion. Well, it wasn't all that it sounded. The title change was only recognized in Omaha, and Vachon left the city, belt in hand, to defend it everywhere else on the American Wrestling Alliance circuit, where nobody would know of this match taking place. 2 weeks later Vachon returned, and they did a gimmick where Vachon got a lucky first fall win, and ran away for the rest of the match, which went 60-0, escaping with the belt back around his waist. Woods, who took up pro wrestling rather late, starting at age 29 after a stellar amateur career, had just come in from Texas. He got his first push because promoter Dory Funk Sr. liked to use former amateur wrestlers for their sports credibility, and also because he thought, correctly, it gave he and his sons more athletic credibility when they would out-wrestle them. Wood's major push in that city came when he ended a long winning streak of Dory Funk Jr. in Amarillo in 1965 in a match to determine who would get a shot at NWA champion Lou Thesz the next week. Known since the age of 11 as Tim Wooden, his real first name was George, but because he was so small for his age but such an awesome wrestler having started young in his hometown of Ithaca, New York, he was nicknamed Tiny Tim, and it stuck. He had it shortened to Woods for pro wrestling when he started as a prelim wrestler in the old WWF territory in late 1962. He had just gotten engaged, and remained with wife Tiger, in a sense, the original Tiger Woods, for the next 4 decades. He went into pro wrestling, giving himself a set time limit of a few years to become a main eventer. In his rookie year, he mainly was known for losing television matches to the top heels in the territory and getting an occasional win. He worked low on the cards, working 9 times in Madison Square Garden in 1963 before heading to Florida, where he worked most of 1964 before getting his first break in Texas. His Madison Square Garden record included prelim wins over Jose Quiñones, who later became one of his biggest rivals in the Southeast under the name Buddy Colt. His background was very different than most wrestlers of the era. He grew up in a poor family, but was so good at wrestling that local coach Jimmy Miller was able to get him into Wyoming Seminary, a prep school in Pennsylvania where he started applying himself to academics like he did to wrestling. He credited that year with turning his life around. He had been hit hard this year with the death of Miller, at the age of 80, and the death of his idol and good friend, Lou Thesz. Woods used to claim Thesz was the greatest wrestler who ever lived, and Thesz always claimed Woods was among the 25 best ever. An avid photographer and collector, Woods claimed to have the largest collection of Thesz photos in the world. His first match against the other great American career masked man of the era, Dick Destroyer Bayer, was at an AAU meet in 1952, and a time when Wooden was already nationally ranked. Bayer was wrestling for Syracuse while Wooden, who was already ranked nationally, was a high school senior. Bayer, a senior at Syracuse University at the time, won the match, which Wooden denied to everyone in pro wrestling for most of the next 50 years ever took place until finally fessing up to it a year or 2 ago. He was well-spoken and had a strong academic background in a business where most of its participants had neither. He had gotten a degree in agricultural engineering from Cornell University, where he didn't wrestle collegiately, but was a dominant force at the time in the AAU ranks. He went to Oklahoma State University on a wrestling scholarship, and in the 1957 season, he decided to make what may have been a foolhardy move, dropping down from 191 pounds to 177, largely so he could take a shot at unbeatable Dan Hodge of Oklahoma, who was then in his senior year. But Wooden had problems with coach Myron Roderick, who brought in the national champion from Iraq, Adnan Casey, who later became a pro star as Sheikh Adnan al-Casey, General Adnan and Billy White Wolf, who he wanted to push ahead of him for the same spot. Over Christmas break, and before ever wrestling a match for the Cowboys, he quit school and transferred to Michigan State. It cost him the 1957 season and a shot at Hodge. But it was at Michigan State where he became known as a pinning master, second only to Hodge of his era. At Michigan State, he got his second degree in mechanical engineering. But his most memorable match as an amateur was one of his two collegiate losses. In the finals of the 1958 NCAA tournament, in Laramie, Wyoming, he had finished unbeaten in the regular season, capping it off by winning the Big Ten title at 177 pounds a few weeks earlier, pinning everyone in the tournament, finishing with Iowa's Gary Kurt Elmire, who later became better known as the college wrestling coach at Iowa State during the heyday of Dan Gable and Chris Taylor. He breezed through the NCAA tournament that he was heavily favored to win, until meeting and losing to Kurt Elmire in the finals on a close decision, which haunted him for decades. He went unbeaten in 1959, moving back to 191 pounds, but once again lost in the NCAA finals to Art Baker of Syracuse. Wooden did gain a measure of revenge in the semifinals by beating Casey, the man Roderick picked to take his spot, 8-2. For months before Woods arrived in Georgia in 1967, Garibaldi would put his photo in the programs and talk about the mysterious man who had to hide his face because if the top stars knew who he was, they'd be afraid to face him. He was billed as a man who nobody could beat in a legitimate match. When he arrived, he went through opponents with a series of different finishing maneuvers that nobody in that part of the country had ever seen. The gimmick is he could pin you from any position, and from more different angles than anyone they had ever seen. The standing head cradle became one of his long-term trademarks, largely because few wrestlers have ever copied it. It was basically a three-quarter Nelson side roll from amateur wrestling where Mr. Wrestling would end up tying up his foe while at the same time standing on his head. The move was actually legit, developed by accident in a collegiate match when he went for a side roll as a pinning combination, and in rolling and getting the pin, momentarily wound up standing on his head. It popped the crowd big, so he brought it back when he got into pro wrestling. To seal the deal, Garibaldi brought him in, and he'd go to the various weekly cities and both use all these moves nobody had ever seen to win his matches, but also offer an open challenge of $1,000 to any fan who could last 10 minutes with him. Taking on all comers was fraught with risks, and in the case of Woods, one of them reared its ugly head. The belief was that nobody except a top-flight amateur wrestler could hang with him for more than a minute anyway. But at first, it worked like a charm. Mr. Wrestling became the top babyface in Georgia and one of its biggest drawing cards in a long time. Wrestling was a very different beast in those days, as it's ridiculous today to think of any top pro, even those who are legitimately tough guys, doing unscripted matches with fans out of the crowd. There was little in the way of communication. There were wrestling magazines, and lots of fans were aware of them at every magazine counter. But even so, few were aware that Mr. Wrestling had already unmasked in Omaha more than a year earlier. Probably the most famous incident from that time period wasn't scripted. In Columbus, Georgia, a group of thugs from across the border in Alabama started attending the matches, and the biggest of the guys, a notorious tough guy who knew that wrestling was fake, wanted to have it Mr. Wrestling. This had been building up and people on both sides were looking for trouble. Several of the wrestlers brought guns to the building. Nobody was really concerned that the 280-pound street fighter, Arnold Sperling, would be able to handle Woods, even with about a 55-pound weight edge, because the only guys who could hang with him in legit wrestling were world-class level guys. But everyone was concerned about what would happen with his buddies after he didn't. It all happened fast. The wrestlers surrounded the ring to make sure Sperling's buddies didn't attack. Even though they were supposed to wrestle, Sperling immediately sucker-punched Mr. Wrestling and unmasked him, throwing the mask into the crowd, which got things off on a bad foot since no pro wrestlers had been able to unmask him for months. Woods had a dual problem, because he couldn't have his face exposed due to his gimmick, but putting his face in his hands to hide his identity would be disastrous in a street fight. Woods buried his face in his hands until his mask was given back to him. He put it on, and immediately took Sperling down. He started playing with him and embarrassing him as he blew him up, punishing and making fun of him instead of attempting to pin him and get it over with. Sperling twice managed to get to the ropes, but would be immediately taken down again. This quieted Sperling's friends immediately. As he took him down a third time, and went for a crossface to really punish him. Sperling bit one of Woods' fingers off at the first joint, and then spit it out. The remaining part of the finger bounced on the canvas, right in front of midget wrestler Lord Littlebrook. Instead of it being stopped, Woods proceeded to hurt the guy quickly and badly, kicking him hard in the face and back, before it was broken up. Woods was then rushed to the hospital where they attempted to sew the finger back on. It became infected, and he had numerous operations. But he was never able to regain use of it. It also largely ended the practice of wrestlers taking on all comers from the audience. The only practitioners in major circuits after this were Adrian Adonis in Amarillo and perhaps Masa Saito in Georgia. Which, of course, built to a major wrestling angle. It became well known throughout Georgia about what happened, and it only served to make Mr. Wrestling even more of a legend as the guy who put a major hurting on a cocky thug after the guy had both sucker punched him and later bitten his finger off. He went on a winning streak to culminate with a match with NWA World Champion Gene Kiniski at the old Atlanta City Auditorium. The 5,100-seat arena was sold out immediately, reportedly the fastest sellout in the history of the city. After all, by this point the fans thought that nobody could beat Mr. Wrestling, and announcer Ed Caprell reminded the fans that Atlanta had never seen an NWA World title change hands, so it was a chance to be part of history. With Mr. Wrestling getting near falls using his pins from all angles, Kiniski became desperate and started attacking the finger. Ultimately, the referee stopped the match, ruling that Mr. Wrestling needed medical attention because of fear he would lose the finger, even though he wanted to continue. The promotion was so excited about the success of the bout, and the heat coming off the finish, that they planned to take the rematch to Fulton County Stadium and hoped to set an all-time pro wrestling attendance record. However, after Woods got a $400 payoff for his quick sellout, he demanded more or he wouldn't do the stadium match. The promotion, perhaps foolishly at the time, didn't budge. Perhaps, in hindsight, this could have been a career difference maker. If they had set a record crowd, Mr. Wrestling would have been viewed on a different level of star on a national basis. With his background as an amateur, and drawing a house of more than 15,000 people in that era in wrestling, at the Unmasked, he probably would have been considered as a potential world champion when Kiniski went to the Alliance meeting in late 1968 and basically told the promoters to shove it. But Georgia was not an influential territory and he had never worked strong in St. Louis, the most important NWA city. So he wasn't even under consideration when the NWA Board of Directors, through heavy lobbying from Dory Funk Sr., got the title to his son. Mr. Wrestling left for the Carolinas, which at the time was a tag team territory. He joined up with Sammy Steamboat Hawaiian wrestler Sam Mokuahi, who is the wrestler Ricky Steamboat was years later named after because Ricky was originally billed as Sammy's son when he got his first push, and occasionally huge Kentuckian Luke Brown, to feud with teams like Rip Hawk and Swede Hansen, Gene and Lars Anderson and Hiro Matsuda and Missouri Muller. He had a memorable Christmas during this period, as they were doing one-night tournaments that week. With 2 tournaments to win, one in Greenville, South Carolina and the other in Charlotte, he wrestled 11 matches that year on Christmas Day. He then headed to the major Texas office out of Dallas where the business was hot and the money was a lot better, feuding with and losing his mask in a match where Johnny Valentine put up his famous hair. As Tim Woods, he spent the most of the rest of his stay as tag team partner of George Scott, including a 9-month reign holding the American Tag Team Championship. He was brought into Florida with the mask in 1971. He had worked the Florida territory in 1964 as Tim Woods before going to Amarillo, which was becoming a real hotbed at the time, in a new role, as an almost totally scientific heel. The storyline was that the 2 top contenders for NWA World Champion Dory Funk Jr. were collegiate stars such equal ability and records that the Alliance couldn't decide who was the real top contender between the mysterious Mr. Wrestling and Jack Brisco. Although the 2 had never wrestled, they knew each other well. Woods helped Oklahoma promoter Leroy McGurk recruit Brisco, the 1965 NCAA champion at 191 pounds, who was wrestling for Roderick. Brisco had made it clear his life's goal was to be a pro wrestler like his heroes Thez and Hodge, and Woods was one of the first guys to teach him the ropes. The storyline started that they were both great wrestlers going after the same thing. Mr. Wrestling didn't wrestle as a heel, but made subtle heel remarks. Since Brisco was the local star and so popular, it was a unique kind of heel heat for the time period. Brisco would say he respected the man's ability, but refused to call the masked man Mr. Wrestling. Wrestling was then offended by the slight. They started out doing supposed amateur wrestling matches, with local promoter and noted area amateur wrestling coach John Heath as referee. They would trade takedowns and keep the score close until Brisco would suddenly get a run of points and Mr. Wrestling would lose his temper. They then went to pro matches and numerous time-limit draws in scientific matches where wrestling would elbow on the break or do something very subtle to turn heel late in the match as Brisco was out wrestling him, proving nothing. Eventually, Brisco beat Mr. Wrestling with a figure 4 leg lock, with the gimmick Wrestling tore knee ligaments from waiting so long before submitting to the move. Wrestling came back wearing a knee brace, with the gimmick that when Brisco would then apply the figure 4, Mr. Wrestling wouldn't feel any pain and would be able to reverse it. At one point he turned the knee brace around and used it as a foreign object to beat Brisco and heat up their issue. As a heel he also feuded with a man under a hood as the Grappler, who later became his tag team partner when he turned face, Johnny Walker. Eddie Graham had been grooming Brisco for years, so he eventually went over in the feud, ending by beating Mr. Wrestling for his mask to set up matches with Funk Jr. As Tim Woods he turned babyface and had memorable feuds with Buddy Colt, Bobby Shane, Dusty Rhodes, Valentine and Paul Jones over the different regional titles as well as several world title matches with Dory Funk Jr. over the next few years. His biggest win was in a tag match in 1972, teaming with Johnny Walker to beat Paul Jones and Dory Funk Jr. when he pinned Funk with a three-quarter Nelson. This set up numerous title matches in Florida, several of which went to 60-0 draws and others of which were won by Funk Jr. While he was a regular on the Florida circuit, amends were made in Georgia and he started appearing there once again, but still with his mask, but largely only in Atlanta on Fridays since he was working the rest of the week in the major Florida cities. While fans in South Georgia who could see Florida TV out of either Jacksonville or Tallahassee were aware Mr. Wrestling was Tim Woods, but in the rest of the state, including the big markets like Atlanta, Columbus, Savannah, and Macon, it was only the small percentage of fans who read wrestling magazines that would have known. He had one match with Funk which ended with the Dusty finish, long before that finish became infamous in the 80s. It was a finish that was great the first time it was used in a territory. In Atlanta, Mr. Wrestling pinned Funk with a three-quarter Nelson with a second ref counting the pin after a ref bump. As he celebrated the win, Dory Funk Sr., who was at ringside, grabbed the belt from him. Sr. grabbed the belt and pulled it so hard it legit cut up Woods' hand and slugged in him, which the original ref then saw, and called for a disqualification on Jr., which meant the title didn't change hands. A photo of the brief moment of him holding the NWA title was his prized possession in his wrestling collection. That match led to grudge matches, where Dory Sr. put up the bounty to bring in the top stars from around the country to either beat or injure him to remove him as a title contender, but naturally failed. Then, one of the nastiest promotional wars ever broke out in Georgia. Ray Gunkel, an amateur star at Purdue, who was part owner of the promotion and one of the state all-time most popular wrestlers dating back to the mid-50s, had returned to a full-time schedule as the company's top babyface after Mr. Wrestling left. Gunkel dropped dead of a heart attack in the dressing room after an August 1, 1972 match with Ox Baker in Savannah, at the age of 47. His widow Ann, a much younger stunning model, had gotten Georgia Wrestling strong local television on Saturday nights on Ted Turner's WTCG, which ultimately changed the history of wrestling. After Ray died, and was looking to have a major say in wrestling operations, the other owners of the territory, Paul Jones, not the famous wrestler of that time period but an aging wrestler from the 20s who had been promoter in Atlanta as far back as anyone could remember, Lester Welch, and Buddy Fuller, father of Ron and Robert Fuller, whose last name was really Welch, wanted to pretend she didn't exist because wrestling was considered a man's business at the time. When she kept making noise, they decided to shut her up by figuratively screwing her. They closed down the company on paper, and then reopened it under another name without her, basically screwing her out of her percentage. Where they miscalculated was that Ray was extremely popular among almost everyone in the company, and even in a cutthroat business as wrestling, screwing his widow so shortly after he died left most of the company up in arms. Suddenly, on Thanksgiving morning, the day of the company's biggest show of the year, an annual tag team tournament which was an automatic sellout because it took place right after a major downtown celebration, Welch, Jones, and Fuller opened up the morning paper and saw a front-page story that virtually every employee and wrestler in their company was quitting and wouldn't be appearing on their show that night, and would be working for Gunkel in her new promotion, called All South Wrestling. With the exception of mid-card babyface Bob Armstrong and a referee, everyone was gone. In a panic, the NWA, still a strong organization at the time, saved the day, sending in many of the biggest names from around the country to save the show in the city. Gunkel even got all of the local promoters to side with her, except Fred Ward, who was on the fence. Ward ran weekly shows in Macon and Columbus, the latter the company's second-best market, and was given 20% of the restructured company to keep those markets on the NWA side, and Ward also for his loyalty was named vice president of the NWA. Atlanta turned into a war zone, with Gunkel running with all the Georgia local favorites every Tuesday night, and the NWA running every Friday night, flying international stars from other territories. Welch and Fuller went to Florida promoter Eddie Graham for help in rebuilding. Through her close friendship with Turner, Gunkel was able to get an hour of wrestling on WTCG, creating the weird situation in a very nasty war. Both shows were taped in the same TV studio on Saturday mornings, the studio that housed Crockett's tapings in the 80s, where wrestlers from both companies shared dressing rooms while their respective bosses wanted to kill each other. In order to save the Georgia market for the NWA, the various NWA promoters from around the country immediately sent their top talent to Georgia to rebuild the circuit, and would send top talent in every Friday night and Saturday morning for TV studio tapings, to win the wrestling war. It was during this period that Gordon Solie was first brought in as announcer to replace Capral, who sided with Gunkel. Graham didn't want a piece of the new company, but suggested to the owners to cut the key stars in for small percentages of the company to keep them from jumping to the opposition. Mr. Wrestling at this point became more valuable than ever as the state's top draw in the middle of a war, so he was cut in for 2.5% of the new company. Also cut in were Bill Watts, who was brought in from Oklahoma to be the booker, Buddy Colt, who was the top heel in the South, and Jack Brisco, who was being groomed by the NWA to be its next world champion. They did a program where the NWA turned Atlanta into the wrestling hotbed. Every Friday night, one of the top 10 contenders would come into Atlanta to try and knock Mr. Wrestling out of his supposed number one contender slot. They did a string of sellouts the last 3 weeks, with Mr. Wrestling beating Kinniski, Luthez and Jack Brisco in succession to lead to the rematch with Dory Jr. That match had another unique finish, as Mr. Wrestling got a series of near falls, and was continually weakening Funk Jr. with the sleeper. At the 47:00 mark, suddenly in a planned spot, the ring broke as Wrestling hit a turnbuckle and he tumbled to the floor, injured, and unable to continue. This was pushed on television as the fluke of all flukes. Everyone couldn't wait for Funk Jr. to return, and Atlanta finally would get its world title change. The name Mr. Wrestling became so strong that the Amarillo circuit in 1972 created an imposter, played by noted shooter Gordon Nelson, the father of Steve Nelson. It was Nelson who went into California in 1973 under the name, working as a heel, mainly in Southern California, but working a few shots in Northern California. A few years later, in a forgettable part of Wood's career, he went into Northern California for 6 months, working mainly prelim and mid-card matches. He came in with the gimmick of going on television and demonstrating amateur wrestling moves. But in that part of the country, where amateur wrestling was never featured as an important part of pro wrestling as it was elsewhere, the segments, with his calm, straightforward interview style, came off as bland. It was an unsuccessful run. Because he was a legitimate national star, he was never asked to do jobs until he was on the way out, and even then, only to the very top heels. In his glory years, he started taking advantage of his wrestling popularity by opening up a restaurant in Atlanta as well as an electronics store called Mr. Audio, which he pushed based on a tagline as the place where Mr. Wrestling will get you the best deals on stereo equipment. While Atlanta was doing well with the national stars, Columbus and Macon were struggling because the national stars were working their home circuits during the week. With Woods as a regular in Florida and doing so well, Eddie Graham didn't want to give him up. They came up with the idea of Mr. Wrestling 2 with the idea he could be the babyface headliner in the other 2 cities. Walker, his frequent tag partner in Florida, was chosen. Walker was considered a great worker, who had been a major star in Tennessee for years before coming to Florida, because of his ability to work his amazing flexibility into matches. He was known at the time as Johnny Rubberman Walker. But by this point he was in his early 40s, and, being bald and haggard, and looked even older, and because of that his career looked like it was just about over. They did an injury angle in Florida, where Valentine supposedly broke both arms of Walker by smashing them into the ring post. Then they did an injury angle in Georgia, where Mr. Wrestling couldn't wrestle in the tournament to crown the new Georgia heavyweight champion that was vacant when Roberto Soto left with Gunkel, and he brought in Mr. Wrestling 2, who was put over in the tournament and became an instant success. It ended up being such a success that Wrestling 2 ended up becoming more popular and a bigger draw than the original. 2 differed from Mr. Wrestling in that he did fired-up interviews, as opposed to the articulate sports style, and did far more brawling, which was new for a pure babyface in Georgia, and made fiery comebacks, building to his $1 million knee lift as a finisher and the catchy chants of 2-2-2. Times were changing in Southern wrestling. The quiet babyface who was a technician and wrestled a legitimate-looking wrestling match on top like Mr. Wrestling, Brisco and Funk Jr. were losing ground to the wilder talking, brawling babyfaces who got by more on charisma, squirming their bodies and dancing, like Wahoo McDaniel and Dusty Rhodes. They went for the big payoff on June 1, 1973 at the new Omni in Atlanta, with Dory Funk Jr. versus Mr. Wrestling. 2 weeks earlier they had run the first Omni wrestling show ever with Bill Watts beating Mr. Wrestling for the Georgia title in the main event, and garnered a ton of media attention by drawing 13,000 fans, the biggest crowd in the history of wrestling in the city. It was a strange result for the show leading up to Mr. Wrestling getting his return shot at Funk Jr. 6 days later in Kansas City, Harley Race ended Funk Jr.'s 4+ year reign as champion. Mr. Wrestling announced on television the Saturday before the show that before the start of the match the next week at the Omni, he would unmask and reveal his identity. He had beaten Race before in Atlanta and everyone expected a title change, as a lot of fans believed the NWA would never allow a masked man to hold the title, and his agreeing to unmask must have been a prelude to a title switch. A crowd of 16,000 sold out the building for the first time ever, for a match that went to a 60-0 draw with Race asleep from the sleeper at the bell. A few months later, Welch and Fuller sold their stock in Georgia Championship Wrestling to Jim Barnett, who had been promoting for years and had turned Australia into one of the hottest wrestling markets in the world, and returned stateside after getting into tax problems overseas. Watts, who never cared for Barnett, quit to become booker in Florida. Jerry Jarrett came in as booker, and his big angle was to do the unthinkable. Woods had left Florida since it was time to move on, and it was natural for him to come full-time to rebuild Georgia, since he was established as a top draw along with being a minority owner. Jarrett had Mr. Wrestling 2 turned heel on Mr. Wrestling, claiming he had to disgrace the sacred mask by taking it off. While most promoters weren't following what was going on outside their territories in those days, Atlanta was different because of the wrestling war. Vince McMahon Sr. even called Barnett to tell him what a terrible idea it was because 2 masked men feuding in the main event would never draw. They had a major and successful feud, including a period of 12 straight sellouts in the City Auditorium, which is credited with winning the promotional war for the NWA. The feud climaxed with 2 winning a mask versus hair match through usage of a foreign object, and Woods had his head shaved. Barnett bought out Gunkel, ending the promotional war and giving Georgia Wrestling a full-time schedule. They were able to get into the cities Gunkel controlled. Jarrett returned to Tennessee since his success in Atlanta caused local promoter Nick Gulas to give him the book. Jarrett years later ended up starting and winning a promotional war with Gulas to take the territory, and Georgia Championship Wrestling got 2 hours every Saturday night on WTCG in Atlanta. Wrestling 1 and 2 got back together as babyfaces when 2 saved him after an attack by the Anderson brothers. When 2 turned back, Wrestling 1, as he was becoming known, had passed his drawing power peak, and became the secondary member of the team. Business was hot in Georgia and television ratings in the local markets were through the roof with the 2 masked men as the top regular faces and the big stars from around the country coming in for the major events. But it was during this period that Wrestling 2 clearly became the man. Many would have had bitterness over a guy coming in with the gimmick you've established, and ultimately, taking your spot as the king of the territory. If that were the case, Woods sure hit it well. Woods and Walker personally remained close friends, and even recent years, even shared rooms together when attending the same old-timers functions. Mr. Wrestling made his first tour of Japan for the 1974 Champion Carnival under the mask, vowing to unmask if anyone could beat him. To get him over as an American technical wrestling marvel, he was put over Japanese Olympians Thunder Sugiyama, who passed away 1 week earlier, and Jumbo Tsuruta, who rarely lost in those days, before losing in the finals, and unmasking, against Giant Baba on May 14, 1974 in Maebashi. He was supposed to be the top foreigner on the tour, but didn't get over as they had hoped for, despite his big wins, as fans were more into the wild bleeders on the tour like Abdullah the Butcher, King Curtis, Iaukea, and Mark Lewin. Because of his success the year before, he was brought back for the 1975 Carnival, and made the Final Four, losing in round-robin competition to eventual winner Baba, Kiniski, and the Destroyer. He was probably also the only active pro wrestler ever to get a sports announcing gig on network television, when he was brought in as a color commentator by ABC's Wide World of Sports when they televised an international freestyle wrestling meet in 1974. He also raced drag cars and motorcycles, and played the piano and saxophone, including as a kid, appearing in a band that played on the popular network Ted Mack Amateur Hour show. The remainder of his career went back and forth between Georgia and his new full-time home in Charlotte. His Carolina stint didn't start out that great, with the famous plane crash. In a sense, the crash could have been the destruction of the territory, and its lessons of what could have happened led to promoters who hadn't done so previously, and strengthened the resolve of those who had already, banning faces and heels from traveling together. In a story that will be covered, coincidentally, on the December 14th edition of WWE Confidential, on October 4, 1975, Carolina's promoter Jim Crockett Jr. and both sets of main eventers for a show that night in Wilmington, North Carolina, at Legion Stadium, which consisted of the territory's two top programs at the time, Wahoo McDaniel vs. Ric Flair for the Mid-Atlantic title and Valentine vs. Woods for the U.S. title, were scheduled to fly in a 6-seat Cessna 310 at 5:30 p.m. However, late that day McDaniel decided to drive to the show, so Bob Bruggers took his place on the plane, and Jim Crockett Jr. at the last minute sent brother David to take his place at the show. To this day, Flair believes had McDaniel not canceled the trip, that the territory would have collapsed for a long time, with the revelation that he and McDaniel, who were bitter storyline rivals, were traveling together. Pilot Joseph Michael Farkas had dumped fuel before taking off because of the weight of the passengers, and the plane ran out of fuel. Farkas, who passed away in the crash that ended the career of both Valentine and Bruggers and left Valentine crippled, radioed the control tower that his engines had stopped when he was about a mile from the Wilmington airport. The plane hit several treetops on the way down and the wing collapsed, hitting a utility pole before the plane crashed about a half-mile short of its destination on a railroad embankment near the state prison. Flair ended up with a broken back in the crash, although later wrestling reports that he was told he would never wrestle again were exaggerated, as he was told shortly after the crash he'd be able to return. Flair was back in the ring 4 months later. Woods left the hospital the next day against doctor's orders in order to avoid word getting out that he was George Burl Wooden and was traveling with Valentine and Flair, and showed up on the next television tapings, despite being barely able to move, to quell rumors that had been started. It probably cost him money in the insurance settlement, but things were very different in those days, as today they all would have had a huge settlement. Farkas, as it turned out, had no insurance, but there was a settlement with Valentine and Bruggers each getting $70,000 and Flair and Crockett getting $38,000. Because Woods left the hospital so quickly, he ended up getting little or nothing. He was not the star of the circuit, wrestling both with and without the mask, but was always kept in a strong position and worked with the top heels. His identity was not made a mystery, as he was Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods, wrestling both with or without the mask. The feeling was that the South Carolina fans, who got the Georgia show from some border city stations, knew his story already. He worked with all the major heels, from Valentine to Mulligan to Flair to Piper, to the Andersons in tag matches. He lost mask versus title matches to Valentine and later, lost his mask and the U.S. title on April 9, 1978 to Flair, in a match where Flair put up his hair. He would still make runs in Georgia, spending much of 1977 there for the Wrestling 1 and 2 vs. Andersons programs over both the World and Georgia Tag Team titles. One of the stories more famous among the wrestlers was the night he and Wahoo McDaniel looked like they were going to go at it. Because the two were babyfaces for most of their respective careers, even though they were headliners and contemporaries, they only wrestled each other twice, once in a tournament in the Carolinas and the second time in a tag match as part of the Real World Tag League tournament in Japan, in 1979. In the first meeting, Woods, who would later praise McDaniel as being the best natural athlete he competed against, wasn't in the mood to take McDaniel's chops, having several matches to wrestle in one day. McDaniel said the chops were his trademark and he had to do them. Woods ended up, before going out to the ring, taking his knee pads off and taping them to his chest, and went to the ring wearing a shirt. McDaniel chopped the knee pads. In the dressing room after the match, the quick-tempered McDaniel was boiling. All the wrestlers were staring because McDaniel was known for not hesitating to fight, and Woods had his own reputation. But it never got past the screaming. When Georgia Championship Wrestling started gaining national exposure with the advent of cable in 1979, Mr. Wrestling 1, who was 45 by this time, was in the role of the former superstar who occasionally wrestled. He would do television matches, frequently push local amateur events, and do in-ring clinics demonstrating the differences between amateur and legitimate pro moves in the ring. When Wrestling 2 would do an occasional injury angle or take an out date, he would be plugged into his spot, such as the feud with Masked Superstar, including losing a masked versus masked match. His last major singles program was in 1980, challenging U.S. champion Jimmy Snuka. He and Mr. Wrestling 2 held their final tag team title reign that year, and were the team that put over the fabulous Freebirds when they first arrived in Georgia for the belts. He wrestled sparingly from that point on, and was the rare headliner who was never relegated to jobber or prelim status. His final pro match was on August 14, 1983 in the main event at the Omni, teaming with Wrestling 2 for the last time, as a legendary team put back together to put over and give legitimacy to the company's new tag team creation, the Road Warriors. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who would complain at functions like the Cauliflower Alley Club meetings about how bad wrestling had gotten, he was matter-of-fact about it and continued to follow it, while remaining close with many of his contemporaries. "It's business," he would say, said longtime friend Bill Murdoch of Asheville. He'd say it's different, and not necessarily better or worse. He had no problem with the changes and would say he was just glad to see the current stars were doing so well. He would enjoy himself when he attended WWF shows. In recent months, he had been very down about not just how many wrestlers had passed away this year, but how many that he knew well, like Nelson Royal, Swede Hansen, Miller, Feuds, Mighty Igor, and Wahoo McDaniel. Among those at Wood's funeral in Charlotte on December 4th were Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Nikita Koloff, Abe Jacobs, Paul Jones, Ron Garvin, David Crockett, Tony Romano, and Louis Tillett. Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods. Career Title History. Source: Wrestling Title Histories 4th edition. American Wrestling Alliance World Heavyweight. Change recognized only in Omaha, Def. Mad Dog Vachon January 7, 1966 Omaha, lost to Mad Dog Vachon January 21, 1966 Omaha. NWA United States Heavyweight, Def. Blackjack Mulligan March 19, 1978 Greensboro, lost to Ric Flair April 9, 1978 Charlotte. NWA World Tag Team with Dino Bravo, Def. Gene and Ole Anderson May 1976, lost to Gene and Ole Anderson July 1976, with Mr. Wrestling 2, Def. Gene and Ole Anderson 1977 Atlanta, lost to Gene and Ole Anderson 1977 Atlanta. NWA Southern Heavyweight, Def. Bobby Shane February 29, 1972 Tampa, lost to Zodiac, Bob Orton Sr., June 24, 1972 Jacksonville, Def. Zodiac August 12, 1972 Tampa, lost to Buddy Colt October 31, 1972 Tampa, Def. Buddy Colt November 21, 1972 Tampa, lost to Buddy Colt December 18, 1972 Orlando. NWA Florida Heavyweight, Def. Paul Jones July 31, 1973 Tampa, lost to Paul Jones 1973. NWA Texas Heavyweight, Def. Johnny Valentine November 11, 1970, lost to Johnny Valentine December 1970. NWA Georgia Heavyweight, Def. El Mongol August 11, 1967 Atlanta, lost to El Mongol September 8, 1967 Atlanta, Def. El Mongol April 12, 1968 Atlanta, lost to Big O, Johnny Valentine Under a Mask, May 10, 1968 Atlanta, Def. Buddy Colt March 1973 Atlanta, lost to Bill Watts May 18, 1973 Atlanta. NWA Florida TV, Def. Jack Brisco September 20, 1972 Tampa, lost to Bobby Shane October 19, 1972 Tampa. NWA Mid-Atlantic TV, Def. Angelo Mosca October 16, 1976, lost to Greg Valentine November 1976. NWA American Tag Team, with George Scott, Def. Dick Murdoch and Dusty Rhodes December 15, 1970 Dallas, lost to Chris Markoff and Bronco Lubick August 1971. NWA Georgia Tag Team with Mr. Wrestling 2, Def. Gene and Ole Anderson August 1974, lost to Gene and Ole Anderson September 13, 1974, with Mr. Wrestling 2, Def. Gene and Ole Anderson January 14, 1977, lost to Gene and Ole Anderson February 25, 1977 Atlanta, with Thunderbolt Patterson, Def. Gene and Ole Anderson April 29, 1977 Atlanta, lost to Gene and Ole Anderson June 1977, with Mr. Wrestling 2, Def. The Assassins September 19, 1980 Griffin, Georgia, lost to Buddy Roberts and Terry Gordy, Freebirds, in three-way involving Assassins October 10, 1980 Atlanta. NWA Florida Tag Team with Hiro Matsuda, Def. Zodiac, Bob Orton Sr. and Taurus, Dennis Hall July 5, 1972 Miami, lost to Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel July 18, 1972 Tampa, with Big Bad John, Def. Bobby Shane and Chris Markoff January 17, 1973 Miami, lost to Bobby Shane and Gorgeous George Jr. February 13, 1973 Tampa. NWA Mid-Atlantic Tag Team, with Dino Bravo, Def. Sergeant Jacques Goulet, René Goulet and Michel Dubois, Alexis Smirnoff, in tournament final November 1976, lost to Buddy Roberts and Jerry Brown 1977. All Japan Champion Carnival Tournament, May 14, 1974, lost to Giant Baba in finals. 1975, went to the Final Four, but lost the round robin to Baba. Winner, Gene Kiniski and the Destroyer. Amateur Wrestling Credentials. 1955, AAU National Freestyle Champion 191 pounds. 1957, AAU National Freestyle Champion 191 pounds. 1958 Big Ten Champion 177 pounds, second place NCAA Championships. 1959 Big Ten Champion 191 pounds, second place NCAA Championships. 1995, inducted into USA Wrestling Hall of Fame All-American Club. 2001, inducted into Lou Thesz/George Tragos Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame,